After I had a ruptured appendix at my workshop, I called my wife and asked her to take me to the ER. She texted back, "I'm at lunch with my longtime lover. Can't just leave." I replied, "Okay." What the police officer said when they approached her table at the restaurant made her wish she hadn't left me waiting. So here's the thing about mornings in my workshop. They're supposed to be predictable as hell. The smell of freshly cut oak hits you like a good cup of coffee. The sawdust settles on everything like nature's glitter, and the steady rhythm of my tools becomes this weird meditation that keeps me sane in an increasingly insane world. My name's Marcus Ellison, by the way, 41 years old and proud owner of what my wife likes to call that dusty hobby shop downtown. Charming, right? 9 years of marriage and she still doesn't get that this dusty hobby shop pays for her designer handbags and weekly spa treatments. But hey, who's keeping track? That particular Thursday morning started exactly like every other morning for the past, I don't know, 5 years maybe? I rolled out of bed at 6:30 sharp, kissed Claire's forehead while she pretended to still be asleep, because God forbid she acknowledge my existence before her first latte, and headed down to the workshop by 7. The familiar creak of the old wooden stairs, the satisfying click of the lights flooding the space, the gentle hum of machinery coming to life. This was my sanctuary, my slice of sanity in a world that seemed hell-bent on driving me completely nuts. I had 3 custom dining chairs to finish for the Hendersons. Nice couple, been together 43 years, and still hold hands at the grocery store, unlike some people I could mention, and a bookshelf that needed its final coat of stain. Simple stuff, honest work, the kind of thing that makes you feel like you actually accomplished something real by the end of the day. Not like those soul-sucking corporate jobs where you shuffle papers around and pretend it matters. But here's where things get interesting. And by interesting, I mean monumentally screwed up. Around 8 in the morning, I started feeling this weird twinge in my stomach. Nothing major, just this dull ache that felt like maybe I'd eaten too much of Mrs. Chin's leftover Chinese food the night before. You know the feeling, when your gut's trying to tell you something, but you're too stubborn or stupid to listen. Classic Marcus move, really. I've been ignoring warning signs my whole damn life, so why stop now? I figured it was nothing. Pop a couple of Tums, drink some water, get back to work. That's the American way, isn't it? Push through the pain, ignore the symptoms, and hope everything works itself out. We're basically trained from birth to treat our bodies like rental cars, run them into the ground, and let the next guy deal with the consequences. So I kept working. Sanded those chair legs until they were smoother than a politician's campaign promises. Applied the stain with careful, even strokes, the way my dad taught me 30 years ago when I was still young enough to think I knew everything. The repetitive motion was soothing, almost hypnotic. Sand, stain, repeat. Sand, stain, repeat. It's amazing how something so simple can make the world feel manageable, even when your personal life's falling apart faster than a house of cards in a hurricane. Around 10 o'clock, my phone buzzed. Claire, of course. "Might be busy for lunch today," she texted, followed by one of those stupid winking emoji that somehow managed to feel both flirty and dismissive at the same time. Now, when your wife of 9 years says she might be busy for lunch, there are basically 2 possibilities. Either she's genuinely swamped with work, which, let's be honest, organizing charity galas for bored rich ladies doesn't exactly qualify as emergency overtime. Or she's planning another one of her mysterious afternoon adventures. I had my suspicions about what busy for lunch really meant. Leonard Hale, her so-called old family friend, had been popping up in conversations a lot lately. Leonard this, Leonard that. Leonard's new Tesla, Leonard's promotion at the law firm, Leonard's fabulous new condo downtown. For a guy who was supposedly just a family friend, Leonard sure seemed to occupy a lot of real estate in my wife's brain. But what was I supposed to do? Accuse her of having an affair based on nothing more than gut instinct and a few too many mentions of Mr. Wonderful? That's a conversation that goes nowhere good, trust me. So I texted back, "Okay, no problem," like the good, understanding husband I'd been trained to be, and went back to my chairs. The stomach pain was getting worse, though. What started as a dull ache had evolved into something sharper, more insistent. Like someone was slowly turning a knife in my gut, testing to see how much I could take before I finally broke down and admitted something was seriously wrong. But Marcus Ellison doesn't break down. Marcus Ellison pushes through. Marcus Ellison is a goddamn warrior. even when he's probably dying of some horrific intestinal plague. By 11:30, I was sweating through my work shirt despite the cool October air. The pain had shifted from mildly annoying to holy crap, this might actually be serious. But I kept working because that's what you do. You don't stop for every little ache and pain. You don't run to the doctor every time your body decides to throw a tantrum. You certainly don't call your wife and interrupt her busy lunch just because you're feeling a little under the weather. Noon rolled around like a freight train. The pain hit me so hard, I actually gasped out loud, dropped my sandpaper, and had to grab the workbench to keep from falling over. This wasn't food poisoning or stress or any of the other convenient excuses I'd been making all morning. This was something real, something urgent, something that required immediate attention whether I wanted to admit it or not. That's when it happened. The moment that changes everything in your neat little life. I was reaching for my phone, finally ready to admit defeat and call for help, when another wave of pain hit me like a sledgehammer to the gut. My knees buckled, my vision went fuzzy around the edges, and suddenly I was on the workshop floor, sawdust in my hair and terror in my chest. I managed to grab my phone with trembling hands and dial Claire's number. My wife of 9 years. My partner in life. The person who promised to love me in sickness and in health, for better or worse, till death do us part. All those beautiful words we said in front of God and everybody. All those promises we made when we were young and stupid and thought love could conquer anything. The phone rang once, twice, then silence. She'd sent it straight to voicemail. That's when I knew, really knew, that my normal morning had turned into something else entirely. Something that was going to change everything, whether I was ready for it or not. You know what's funny about pain? I'm talking real, honest to God, make you question your life choices pain. It has this weird way of sharpening your focus while simultaneously making everything else fade into the background like some twisted meditation technique nobody asked for. There I was, sprawled on my workshop floor like a discarded piece of lumber, sawdust stuck to my sweaty face, watching my phone light up with what I desperately hoped would be my wife's concerned voice asking if I was okay. Maybe even offering to rush over and drive me to the hospital like a normal human being would do for someone they supposedly love. Instead, I got a text message. A goddamn text message. I'm at lunch with Leonard. Can't just leave. 8 words. 8 simple, soul-crushing words that managed to accomplish what years of marriage counseling, countless arguments, and all those awkward silences at dinner parties never could. They showed me exactly where I stood in my wife's list of priorities. Spoiler alert, it wasn't at the top. Hell, it wasn't even in the top 5, apparently. I stared at that message for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 30 seconds, reading it over and over again like maybe the words would magically rearrange themselves into something that didn't make me feel like the world's biggest chump. Can't just leave. Can't just leave. As if abandoning her lunch date with Mr. Wonderful to help her husband, who was currently writhing on a dirty workshop floor in agony, would be some kind of social catastrophe that polite society simply couldn't forgive. The really twisted part? I wasn't even surprised. Not really. Disappointed? Absolutely. Heartbroken? You bet your ass. But surprised? Nah. This was just Claire being Claire, choosing herself and her needs over everyone else's, same as she'd been doing for the better part of our marriage. I'd just been too stupid or too stubborn or too damn hopeful to see it clearly before now. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely type a response. The logical part of my brain, the part that still functioned despite the fact that my appendix was apparently trying to stage a violent coup inside my abdomen, wanted to write something scathing. Something that would make her feel as small and insignificant as she'd just made me feel. Maybe something like, glad to know where I rank compared to your boyfriend, or hope the salmon is worth your husband's life, or just a simple fuck you, repeated 50 times, because sometimes the classics are classic for a reason. But instead, like the pathetic, well-trained husband I'd apparently become, I typed one word. Okay. Okay. As if this whole situation was somehow okay. As if her choosing Leonard over her dying husband was perfectly reasonable behavior that any rational person would understand. As if 9 years of marriage, thousands of shared meals, countless conversations about our future together, and all those nights we'd fallen asleep in each other's arms meant absolutely nothing when stacked up against whatever Leonard Hale was serving at lunch that day. I dropped the phone onto my workbench with more force than necessary, partly because my hands wouldn't stop shaking and partly because I wanted to throw the damn thing across the room and watch it explode into a million tiny pieces. Kind of like my marriage, come to think of it. The pain in my gut was getting worse, if that was even possible. It felt like someone had lit a bonfire inside my intestines and was feeding it gasoline every few minutes just to keep things interesting. Sweat was pouring down my face. My vision kept going in and out of focus, and I was starting to get that weird floaty feeling you get right before you pass out completely. But even through all of that physical agony, the emotional pain was somehow worse. The knowledge that when push came to shove, literally, in this case, my wife would choose someone else over me. How the hell had we gotten here? When did I become the kind of husband who gets abandoned during medical emergencies? When did Claire become the kind of wife who thinks lunch dates are more important than her spouse's well-being? When did our marriage turn into this pathetic charade where we both pretend everything's fine while slowly destroying each other from the inside out? I tried to think back to better times, to remember what we used to be like when we actually gave a damn about each other. Our wedding day, maybe, when she looked at me like I was the only person in the world who mattered. Or our first anniversary, when we were still poor as church mice, but happy enough to make it work. Or that time 3 years ago when I surprised her with tickets to see Hamilton and she actually cried because she was so excited. Real tears, not the fake ones she'd perfected for getting out of traffic tickets. But those memories felt like they belonged to different people. Younger, stupider people who actually believed in things like forever and unconditional love and all that romantic bullshit they sell you in movies and greeting cards. People who hadn't yet learned that marriage is less like a fairy tale and more like a long, slow negotiation where you gradually give up pieces of yourself until you're not sure who you were before you started. The workshop door creaked open, and I heard Diego's voice calling my name. Diego Morales, my apprentice, 23 years old and still young enough to believe the world makes sense. He'd been with me for 2 years now, learning the trade, talking about maybe starting his own shop someday. Good kid. Works hard, shows up on time, doesn't spend his lunch breaks screwing around with other people's wives. Novel concept, apparently. Boss, you okay in here? I heard. Oh shit, Mr. E, what happened? I tried to answer him, tried to explain that my appendix was apparently staging a rebellion and my wife was too busy playing footsie with Leonard to care, but all that came out was a strangled groan that sounded more like a dying animal than actual human communication. Diego's face went pale, and he immediately pulled out his phone. I'm calling 911, he said, and I wanted to tell him not to bother, that Claire would probably just text the paramedics to let them know she was busy and couldn't be disturbed, but the words wouldn't come out right. As Diego talked to the emergency dispatcher, giving them the workshop address and describing my condition in rapid-fire Spanish-accented English, I closed my eyes and tried to process what had just happened. Not the medical emergency. That was just my body deciding to malfunction at the worst possible moment. No, the real catastrophe was that text message, those 8 little words that had just blown up everything I thought I knew about my marriage. Can't just leave. Funny thing is, she was right. She really couldn't just leave. Not Leonard, anyway. Apparently, leaving me was no problem at all. Let me tell you something about ambulance rides. They're nothing like what you see in the movies. There's no dramatic music, no slow-motion shots of heroic paramedics saving the day, and definitely no romantic subplot where the patient falls in love with the beautiful EMT. What you get instead is a lot of bumping around on a stretcher that feels like it was designed by someone who's never actually had a back, bright lights that make your eyes water, and the constant beeping of machines that seem determined to remind you that your body is basically a piece of shit that's failing you at the worst possible moment. The sirens were loud enough to wake the dead, which was ironic considering I felt like I was halfway to joining them. Every pothole Diego's 911 call had saved me from experiencing on foot. I was now getting the full VIP treatment courtesy of Chicago's famously smooth road maintenance program. Each bump sent a fresh wave of agony through my abdomen, like someone was playing pinball with my internal organs and losing badly. The paramedic working on me, a middle-aged guy named Steve who looked like he'd seen every possible way the human body could malfunction, was asking me questions I could barely process through the haze of pain and morphine they'd already started pumping into my system. Name, age, medical history, Emergency contact. You know, the fun stuff you really want to discuss while your appendix is apparently trying to explode like a biological hand grenade. Emergency contact? Steve repeated, pen poised over his clipboard like he was about to take down the most important information in the world. My wife, I managed to croak out, then immediately felt stupid for saying it. My wife, who couldn't be bothered to leave her lunch date when I called her literally dying. My wife, who was probably at this very moment laughing at Leonard's jokes while her husband got loaded into an ambulance like a sack of broken furniture. Claire Ellison. Steve nodded and jotted down the information while his partner, a younger woman who looked like she could bench press a small car, monitored my vitals and adjusted 4 drips with the kind of efficiency that comes from years of dealing with people in various stages of medical crisis. These folks had their shit together, unlike certain other people I could mention. We'll make sure she's notified, Steve said, which made me want to laugh if I wasn't currently focused on not passing out or vomiting or both. Oh, they'd notify her all right. Probably get sent straight to voicemail, just like I did. Or maybe they'd be lucky enough to get another text message explaining how she couldn't just leave her important lunch meeting to deal with trivial matters like her husband's medical emergency. The ambulance pulled up to St. Augustine's emergency room with all the subtlety of a small earthquake. You know that feeling when you're a kid and you go to the hospital to visit someone, and everything seems so clean and sterile and important? Well, when you're the patient getting wheeled in on a gurney, it feels more like being fed into some kind of medical meat grinder that's going to chew you up and spit out whatever's left of your dignity, along with a bill that'll make you wish you'd just died quietly at home. The ER was exactly what you'd expect from a big city hospital on a Thursday afternoon. Controlled chaos with a side of barely contained panic. Nurses rushed around like they were competing in some kind of efficiency Olympics. Doctors barked orders in medical jargon that sounded like a foreign language. And somewhere in the background, someone was having what appeared to be a complete breakdown while arguing with their insurance company. Just another day in America's healthcare paradise. They got me into a room faster than I expected, which either meant my condition was serious enough to bump me up the priority list, or Thursday afternoons were unusually slow for medical emergencies. A doctor who looked young enough to be carded at a bar introduced herself as Dr. Martinez and started poking and prodding my abdomen with the kind of focused intensity usually reserved for bomb disposal experts. Definitely appendicitis, she announced after about 30 seconds of exploration that felt like she was trying to rearrange my internal organs by hand. Looks like it's ruptured. We need to get you into surgery immediately. Ruptured. That's a word you never want to hear in relation to any part of your body, but especially not the parts that are supposed to stay sealed up inside where they belong. Apparently, while I was busy having my emotional breakdown over Claire's text message, my appendix had decided to stage its own dramatic finale by exploding like a tiny biological bomb. Just perfect. As if this day wasn't already shaping up to be one for the record books. We've tried calling your emergency contact multiple times, one of the nurses mentioned while they prepped me for surgery. No answer. Is there someone else we should call? 3 attempts. They'd tried 3 times to reach Claire, and she'd ignored every single one. While I was literally being prepped for emergency surgery, my loving wife was apparently so engrossed in her lunch date that she couldn't be bothered to answer her phone. I wondered what Leonard was saying that was so fascinating it was worth ignoring multiple calls from a hospital. Maybe he was reciting poetry. Maybe he was explaining his stock portfolio. Or maybe he was just really good at whatever the hell they were doing that was more important than her husband's life. That's when Sergeant Harper walked into the room. Tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of no-nonsense demeanor that comes from years of dealing with people at their absolute worst. Diego must have mentioned to the paramedics that my wife was unreachable, because apparently when someone gets rushed to the hospital and their spouse can't be bothered to answer the phone, the cops get involved to make sure there's no foul play involved. Mr. Ellison? I'm Sergeant Harper, Chicago PD. We understand your emergency contact isn't responding to calls from the hospital. Is there somewhere specific we should look for her? Here's where things get interesting. I could have just given him Claire's office number, or told him to try again later, or suggested he call one of her friends. But something about lying on that hospital bed, about to go under the knife while my wife enjoyed her romantic lunch, made me feel reckless in a way I'd never felt before. Like I had absolutely nothing left to lose, which was probably true. The Sterling Room, I said, my voice sounding stronger than it had all day. Fifth Avenue. She's having lunch with Leonard Hale. Sergeant Harper raised an eyebrow, the kind of look cops give you when they've just realized there's more to the story than meets the eye. You want us to go there in person? I closed my eyes and pictured it. Two uniformed police officers walking into that fancy restaurant where Claire and Leonard were probably sharing dessert and making plans for their next rendezvous. Every conversation stopping mid-sentence, every head turning. The sudden silence that falls when authority figures show up unexpectedly. Claire's face going pale when she realizes this isn't some random police visit. This is about her husband, the one she couldn't be bothered to take calls from. Yeah, I said, surprised by how calm I sounded. Tell her in person. You know what's beautiful about morphine? It doesn't just dull physical pain. It also gives you this weird kind of clarity, like someone just cleaned the windshield of your brain after years of driving through emotional mud. Lying there on that hospital bed, watching the ceiling tiles blur and shift while they prepped me for surgery, I found myself doing something I hadn't done in years. I was actually thinking clearly about my marriage, my choices, and the spectacular train wreck my life had become. Sergeant Harper had given me one of those looks, part professional concern, part, oh shit, this is about to get interesting, before nodding and heading out to deliver my message. And let me tell you, the mental image of what was about to happen at the Sterling Room was better than any painkiller they could pump into my veins. I'm talking about a level of satisfaction that goes way beyond petty revenge and straight into the realm of cosmic justice. Picture this. The Sterling Room, Chicago's most pretentious restaurant, where they charge $40 for a piece of fish that's smaller than a playing card, and the waiters talk about wine like they're discussing ancient philosophy. It's the kind of place where rich people go to feel important while eating overpriced food that looks like modern art, but tastes like expensive disappointment. Claire loves that place, of course. It makes her feel sophisticated, like she's living the kind of life she deserves instead of being married to a guy who makes furniture for a living. I could see it all playing out in my mind like some twisted daytime drama. Claire and Leonard at their usual table, because of course they have a usual table, like there's some kind of power couple instead of two people destroying someone else's marriage, probably discussing whatever important matters occupy the minds of cheating spouses and their accomplices. Maybe Leonard's telling her about his latest legal victory, or his new BMW, or how his ex-wife is being such a bitch about the alimony payments. Real stimulating conversation, I'm sure. The restaurant would be buzzing with its typical lunch crowd. Investment bankers trying to impress clients, real estate moguls making deals over $70 steaks, society wives gossiping about charity events and plastic surgery procedures. Everyone dressed to the nines. Everyone performing their little roles in Chicago's endless social theater. Everyone pretending their lives are more important and interesting than they actually are. Then the door opens, and in walk two Chicago police officers in full uniform. Not detectives in cheap suits, not undercover cops trying to blend in. Actual uniformed officers with badges and utility belts and everything that screams official police business. The entire restaurant would go quiet faster than a church during prayer time. Conversations would die mid-sentence, forks would stop halfway to mouths, and suddenly everyone would be trying to figure out which one of them was about to have their day completely ruined. The officers would scan the room, maybe check with the maitre d', some snooty guy named Francois or Pierre, who probably grew up in Newark but affects a French accent to match the restaurant's pretentious vibe, and then they'd start making their way through the dining room. Past the table where two pharmaceutical executives are discussing their latest acquisition, past the booth where a city councilman is taking a bribe from a construction contractor, past all the other little dramas playing out in Chicago's temple of overpriced cuisine. And then they'd stop at Claire's table. I could picture her face so clearly it was almost like watching a movie. First confusion, because why would police officers be interrupting her important lunch with Leonard? Then recognition. Because even Claire isn't stupid enough not to realize that cops showing up at your restaurant table probably means someone you know is in serious trouble. Then panic. That moment when your brain starts running through all the possible disasters that could have brought uniformed officers to your doorstep, or in this case, your table. Ma'am, are you Claire Ellison? She'd nod, probably unable to speak, her face going pale while Leonard sits there trying to figure out if he should stay or bolt for the exit. Every other diner in the place would be pretending not to stare while desperately trying to hear every word of whatever drama was about to unfold. "We're here about your husband, Marcus Ellison. He's been rushed to St. Augustine's Hospital for emergency surgery. We've been trying to reach you." That's when it would hit her. Not just that I was in the hospital, not just that she'd ignored multiple calls from medical professionals trying to reach her, but that everyone in this fancy restaurant now knew exactly what kind of wife she was. The kind who can't be bothered to answer her phone when her husband is dying because she's too busy screwing around with another man. I imagined her fumbling for excuses, trying to explain to the officers why she hadn't answered her phone, why she hadn't rushed to the hospital the moment I called her in agony. But what could she possibly say? "Sorry, officers, I was busy committing adultery and couldn't take time out of my busy schedule to care about my husband's medical emergency." The beauty of it was that she couldn't even be angry about the public humiliation, because technically I'd done everything right. I'd called her first when I was in trouble. She'd chosen not to answer. The hospital had tried to reach her multiple times. She'd ignored those calls too. The police were simply doing their job, making sure my emergency contact was properly notified. If she felt embarrassed or exposed, well, that was entirely her own doing. Leonard would probably try to make himself invisible, maybe excuse himself to use the restroom, and then sneak out the back door like the coward he undoubtedly was. After all, getting involved with a married woman is one thing when it's all secret and exciting, but having police officers show up at your lunch date tends to make the whole affair feel a lot less glamorous and a lot more sordid. The other diners would pretend to go back to their conversations, but really they'd be filing away every detail to share with their friends and colleagues later. By evening, half of Chicago's social circle would know that Claire Ellison had been publicly called out by the police for ignoring her hospitalized husband's emergency. The story would spread like wildfire through the gossip networks that keep places like the Sterling Room in business. As the anesthesiologist started explaining what was about to happen during my surgery, I found myself smiling for the first time all day. Not because I was happy about having my appendix removed, obviously, but because for once in my marriage, Claire was about to face some actual consequences for her choices. No more hiding behind excuses or manipulation or playing the victim. Just her, Leonard, 2 police officers, and a restaurant full of witnesses to her complete failure as a wife. Sometimes justice comes in the strangest forms. Sometimes it wears a badge and interrupts your lunch. There's something deeply surreal about lying on a hospital gurney in a surgical gown that makes you feel like a mental patient, watching a team of medical professionals discuss your internal organs like they're talking about the weather. Dr. Martinez was going over my chart with someone who looked like he'd stepped out of a Grey's Anatomy casting call. Tall, confident, probably makes more money in a month than I see in a year. The kind of guy Claire would definitely find attractive, which was a weird thought to have while they were literally about to cut me open, but morphine makes your brain go to some strange places. Ruptured appendix, significant peritoneal contamination. We need to get him in there ASAP, Dr. Martinez was saying, using those cheerful medical terms that sound so much more pleasant than "your guts are full of poison and you might die." I appreciated the professional enthusiasm, really. Nothing like a surgeon who's excited about the prospect of rooting around inside your abdomen with sharp instruments. The surgical prep team moved around me with the kind of choreographed efficiency you usually see at NASCAR pit stops. Except instead of changing tires, they were hooking me up to various machines and inserting tubes into places I'd prefer not to think about. For lines, heart monitors, oxygen sensors. Apparently, it takes a lot of technology to keep one middle-aged furniture maker from dying on the operating table. Who knew? That's when Diego showed up, looking like he'd just run a marathon through downtown Chicago. His work clothes were covered in sawdust, my sawdust, from when he'd found me collapsed on the workshop floor, and his face had that pale, shocked expression people get when someone they care about suddenly becomes a medical emergency. Kid was only 23, probably never dealt with anything more serious than a splinter or a hangover, and here he was having to play the role of responsible adult because the actual adults in my life were too busy with their lunch dates to give a damn. "Mr. E. Jesus Christ, are you okay? I mean, obviously you're not okay, but you know what I mean. The doctors," they said. He was babbling, which was understandable given the circumstances. Diego's a good kid, works hard, never complains, always shows up on time. Everything my wife apparently isn't. "I'm gonna be fine, Diego," I managed to say, though honestly I had no idea if that was true. For all I knew, I was about to become one of those cautionary tales about middle-aged men who ignore obvious symptoms until it's too late. Thanks for calling 911. You probably saved my life. Where's Mrs. E? He asked, looking around the ER like maybe Claire was hiding behind one of the medical equipment carts. I called the shop, but nobody answered. I tried her cell, but she's busy, I said, which was probably the understatement of the century. Don't worry about it. She'll show up eventually. Or not. At this point, it was anybody's guess whether my wife would grace us with her presence before or after my surgery. Maybe she'd time her arrival perfectly to coincide with my discharge, so she could play the concerned wife without actually having to deal with any of the messy, inconvenient parts of having a hospitalized spouse. That's when Raymond walked through the door, and I swear to God, I almost started crying right there on the gurney. Raymond Torres, my best friend since college. The guy who was best man at my wedding and probably should have talked me out of it if he'd been paying closer attention. Ray's one of those rare people who actually means it when he says he'll be there for you, unlike certain other people I could mention. He looked around the ER with the kind of controlled anger that comes from years of being a high school principal. The expression he probably wears when dealing with particularly stupid administrators or parents who think their precious little snowflakes can do no wrong. But his anger wasn't directed at me. It was aimed squarely at the situation, and more specifically, at the notable absence of my wife. Diego called me, Ray said without preamble, pulling up a chair next to my gurney like he was planning to camp out there until this whole mess was resolved. Where the hell is Claire? Having lunch with Leonard, I said, and watched Ray's face go through several interesting color changes. First confusion, then recognition, then a kind of cold fury that made me glad we were in a public place with lots of witnesses and security cameras. She didn't come? She really didn't come? Ray's voice had dropped to that dangerous quiet level that teachers use right before they destroy a student's entire academic career with a single phone call home. Your appendix ruptures, you're rushed to the hospital for emergency surgery, and she doesn't come. She can't just leave, I said, repeating Claire's exact words from her text message. Apparently lunch with Leonard takes priority over her husband's medical emergency. Ray started pacing the small space next to my bed, muttering things in Spanish that I was pretty sure weren't compliments to my wife's character. Diego, meanwhile, was looking back and forth between us like he was watching a tennis match, probably trying to figure out who Leonard was and why his existence was making Mr. Torres look like he wanted to commit murder. The nurses were bustling around, doing those final pre-surgery checks that make you realize this is actually happening, that in a few minutes you're going to be unconscious while strangers cut you open and remove parts of your body you've had for 41 years. Dr. Martinez came by to explain the procedure one more time, using simple terms like I was a particularly slow child who needed extra help understanding why surgery was necessary. The appendix has definitely ruptured, she said, pointing to some x-rays that looked like abstract art to me. We need to remove it and clean out the infection before it spreads further. It's a routine procedure, but because of the rupture, recovery might take a bit longer than usual. Routine procedure. I loved how doctors could describe cutting into your abdomen and removing organs as routine, like they were changing the oil in your car or replacing a broken light bulb. I suppose when you do this kind of thing every day, it does become routine, but for those of us on the receiving end, it feels pretty damn dramatic. That's when my phone buzzed with another text message. Ray grabbed it before I could reach for it, and I watched his face darken as he read whatever Claire had sent. What does it say? I asked, though part of me really didn't want to know. Ray held up the phone so I could see the screen. 3 messages, sent in rapid succession. Can't believe you sent police to the restaurant. You embarrassed me. Overreacting. Overreacting. While my appendix was literally exploding inside my body, while I was being prepped for emergency surgery, while the love of my life was choosing another man over her husband's medical crisis, I was apparently overreacting by having the police deliver a message when she wouldn't answer her goddamn phone. Ray looked like he wanted to throw my phone against the wall, but instead he just set it down on the bedside table with the kind of careful control that suggested he was about 2 seconds away from driving to the Sterling room himself and having a very different kind of conversation with my wife. Marcus, he said, his voice deadly calm. When you get out of surgery, we need to talk. Waking up from surgery is like being dragged back to consciousness through a thick fog made of cotton balls and broken dreams. Everything feels disconnected. Your body, your thoughts, even your sense of time gets all scrambled up like someone took your brain and put it in a blender with a bunch of anesthesia. The first thing I noticed was the steady beeping of machines, which I guess meant I was still alive, so that was a plus. The second thing I noticed was the dull, throbbing ache in my abdomen where they'd apparently removed my rebellious appendix and hopefully cleaned up whatever mess it had made of my insides. The third thing I noticed was my phone, sitting on the bedside table like a tiny electronic bomb, just waiting to explode my temporary peace into a million jagged pieces. I should have left it alone. I should have focused on recovering, on being grateful that modern medicine had prevented me from dying of something that would have killed me 100 years ago, on appreciating the fact that Diego and Raymond had been there for me when it mattered. But no, like an idiot, I reached for that phone with hands that still felt like they belonged to someone else, fumbling with the screen until I could see what new messages had arrived while I was unconscious. 3 new texts from Claire. Because apparently while I was having my guts rearranged by surgical instruments, my loving wife had been busy crafting the perfect response to her husband's medical emergency. I could practically see her sitting in that expensive restaurant, or maybe back at her spa, carefully composing these messages like she was writing a term paper on how to be the worst possible spouse in human history. The first message, sent about an hour after the police had undoubtedly interrupted her romantic lunch. You always make drama out of nothing. Drama out of nothing. Let me just process that for a second. According to my wife of 9 years, having a ruptured appendix, being rushed to the hospital in an ambulance, and requiring emergency surgery qualified as drama out of nothing. Apparently, in Claire's world, only her problems count as real emergencies. My near-death experience was just me being melodramatic, probably for attention or something equally pathetic. I could picture her typing that message, maybe sitting in Leonard's fancy car while he drove her home, explaining to him how her husband was always pulling stunts like this to ruin her good times. Poor Claire, stuck with such a dramatic husband who has the nerve to get life-threatening medical conditions at inconvenient moments. How selfish of me to schedule my appendix rupture during her important lunch date. The second message, sent 20 minutes later. Leonard needed me. Leonard needed her. Leonard fucking needed her. Not wanted her, not enjoyed her company, but needed her. Like she was performing some kind of essential service that only she could provide. Some crucial function that was more important than her husband's survival. What could Leonard possibly need that was more urgent than a medical emergency? Was he having an existential crisis? A fashion emergency? Did he need someone to hold his hand while he made difficult decisions about which expensive wine to order? I tried to imagine what kind of need Leonard could have that would justify ignoring multiple phone calls from a hospital. Maybe he was having trouble deciding between the lobster and the duck. Maybe he needed emotional support while discussing his latest real estate investment. Or maybe, and this seemed most likely, he needed Claire to validate his ego by choosing him over her husband, by proving that she valued his company more than her marriage vows. The third message was the real kicker, sent just half an hour ago. You've always been too weak for me. Too weak. There it was. The truth she'd probably been thinking for years, but had never quite worked up the courage to say out loud. According to Claire, I was weak. Not sensitive, not caring, not devoted, weak. Weak for building her a successful business with my own hands. Weak for working 60-hour weeks to pay for her lifestyle. Weak for cooking dinner when she was too tired from her demanding schedule of shopping and lunch dates. Weak for loving her unconditionally even when she gave me every reason not to. You know what's funny about being called weak? It has this weird way of clarifying things that have been fuzzy for way too long. Like suddenly realizing that the person you've been bending over backwards to please, the person you've been sacrificing your own happiness for, the person you've been making excuses for year after year, actually has nothing but contempt for you. It's liberating in the most painful way possible. I stared at that last message until the words started to blur together, not from the medication, but from something that felt suspiciously like tears. Too weak for her. After 9 years of marriage, thousands of shared meals, countless conversations about our future, all those nights we'd fallen asleep together, all those mornings we'd woken up in the same bed, this was what she really thought of me. that I was too weak to deserve her. The really twisted part was that she might have been right. Not about being weak in general. It takes strength to build a business, to work with your hands, to create something beautiful from raw materials. But weak when it came to her? Yeah, probably. I'd been weak enough to ignore the warning signs, weak enough to make excuses for her behavior, weak enough to convince myself that our marriage was worth saving even when she'd clearly checked out years ago. I'd been weak enough to believe that love was supposed to be unconditional, that marriage was about supporting each other through good times and bad, that the person you choose to spend your life with should actually give a damn whether you live or die. Apparently, those were just naive fairy tale concepts that real, strong people like Claire had grown beyond. But here's the thing about being called weak by someone whose opinion you used to value. It has this weird way of making you want to prove them wrong. Not to win them back, not to change their mind, but just to show yourself that you're capable of more than they ever gave you credit for. It's like being challenged to a fight you didn't know you wanted to have until someone threw the first punch. I looked around the hospital room, taking in the sterile white walls, the efficient medical equipment, the flowers that Diego had apparently brought while I was unconscious. This was my life now, recovering from surgery while my wife sent text messages explaining why I wasn't worth her time. But maybe that was okay. Maybe this was exactly the wake-up call I needed. Too weak for her? We'd see about that. I deleted all 3 messages without responding. If Claire wanted to know how her husband was doing after his emergency surgery, she could damn well pick up the phone and call like a normal human being. I was done making it easy for her to treat me like garbage. For the first time in years, I felt something that might have been hope. I must have drifted off again after deleting Claire's messages, because the next thing I knew, someone was shaking my shoulder with the kind of gentle insistence that said, "Wake up, but don't panic about it." When I opened my eyes, I was looking at a face I hadn't seen in person for almost 6 months. My older brother Malcolm, standing next to my hospital bed like some kind of avenging angel in a wrinkled dress shirt and jeans that suggested he'd driven straight through the night to get here. Malcolm's 3 years older than me, about 2 inches taller, and has always carried himself with the kind of quiet confidence that comes from being the responsible one in the family. He's a mechanical engineer up in Milwaukee, married to a wonderful woman named Sarah, father to 2 kids who actually like spending time with their parents. In other words, he's everything I thought I was building toward before my life decided to take this spectacular detour into dysfunction and medical emergencies. "You look like shit," Malcolm said, which was his way of expressing concern. The Ellison brothers have never been big on emotional displays, preferring to show affection through insults and practical help rather than mushy declarations of love. It's a family tradition that goes back generations, probably to some stoic Scottish ancestors who thought feelings were a sign of weakness. "Feel like shit too," I replied, trying to sit up straighter and immediately regretting it when my abdominal muscles reminded me that they'd recently been through a rather invasive surgical procedure. "How do you know I was here?" "Raymond called me around midnight," Malcolm said, settling into the visitor's chair like he was planning to stay a while. "Told me what happened. Told me about Claire." The way he said my wife's name made it sound like he was referring to some kind of communicable disease. I drove down as soon as I could get away from work. 3 hours. Malcolm had driven 3 hours through the night to be here for his little brother, while my wife couldn't be bothered to leave a restaurant 5 miles away. The contrast wasn't lost on me, and judging by the expression on Malcolm's face, it wasn't lost on him either. "Where is she?" he asked, looking around the room like maybe Claire was hiding behind one of the medical equipment stands. "Your wife, I mean. Shouldn't she be here pretending to give a damn about your recovery?" "She's busy," I said, which was becoming my standard response to questions about Claire's whereabouts. Important lunch meetings and such. Malcolm's jaw tightened in a way that reminded me of our father when he was about to deliver one of his legendary lectures about responsibility and character. Dad had been gone for 5 years now, but his influence lived on in moments like this, when one of his sons was about to lay down the law about what was and wasn't acceptable behavior. "Show me the messages," Malcolm said suddenly. "What messages?" "Don't bullshit me, Marcus. Raymond told me she was texting you instead of coming to the hospital. Show me what she said." I hesitated, partly because I deleted the messages and partly because there's something humiliating about showing your older brother proof that your wife thinks you're a pathetic loser. But Malcolm had that look in his eyes, The same expression he'd worn when we were kids, and he was about to go beat up whoever had been picking on me at school. Some things never change. I deleted them, I admitted. Good, Malcolm said. But I want to know what they said. Every word. So I told him. About the drama comment, about Leonard needing her, about being too weak. I watched Malcolm's face go through several interesting color changes as I recounted each message, his expression getting darker with every word until he looked like he was seriously considering driving to wherever Claire was and having a very direct conversation about marriage vows and basic human decency. Too weak, Malcolm repeated slowly, like he was testing the words to see how they tasted. She said you were too weak for her. That's what she said. Malcolm stood up and started pacing the small room, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. This was his thinking pose, the way he'd looked when we were teenagers, and he was figuring out how to fix my latest disaster or solve some problem that was beyond my capabilities. But this wasn't a teenage problem that could be solved with a brotherly heart-to-heart or a loan from his summer job money. This was adult-level dysfunction that required adult-level solutions. No more, Malcolm said finally, stopping his pacing and turning to face me with the kind of determination usually reserved for people about to storm beaches or climb mountains. This ends here, Marcus. Right now. Today. What are you talking about? I'm talking about the fact that you've been letting this woman walk all over you for years, and now she's basically told you she doesn't give a shit if you live or die as long as her boyfriend keeps her entertained. Malcolm's voice was getting louder, and I was grateful we were in a private room instead of one of those curtained-off areas where every conversation becomes public entertainment. She's my wife, Malcolm. It's not that simple. The hell it isn't. Marriage is supposed to be a partnership, not a hostage situation. When's the last time she actually acted like she cared about you? When's the last time she put your needs before her own wants? When's the last time she made you feel like you mattered to her? Those were excellent questions that I really didn't want to think about, mainly because I couldn't remember the answers. When had Claire last made me feel valued or appreciated or even liked? When had she last chosen me over something else she wanted more? When had she last acted like my wife instead of some annoying roommate who occasionally showed up to complain about my lifestyle choices? Look, Malcolm continued, his voice getting calmer but no less determined. I've been watching this train wreck for years, hoping you'd figure it out on your own. But you haven't, and now she's basically telling you that your life doesn't matter to her. So I'm going to help you fix this situation whether you want me to or not. Fix it how? Malcolm pulled out his phone and started scrolling through his contacts. First, we're calling a locksmith. Then we're calling a moving company. By the time you get out of this hospital, Claire's stuff will be packed up and waiting for her to collect it, and she won't have keys to get back into your house. You can't just... Watch me, Malcolm said, already dialing. You said she thinks you're too weak for her? Fine. Let's show her what strong looks like. I wanted to argue, wanted to point out that this was crazy, that you can't just kick your wife out without trying to work things out first. But then I thought about those text messages, about her choosing Leonard over my medical emergency, about years of being treated like an inconvenience in my own marriage. Maybe Malcolm was right. Maybe it was time to stop being weak. Locksmith first, Malcolm said into his phone, then movers. We've got work to do. Saturday morning arrived with all the subtlety of a freight train carrying a cargo of life-changing decisions. I'd been discharged from the hospital Friday afternoon with a list of post-surgical instructions that basically boiled down to don't lift anything heavy and try not to die, which seemed reasonable enough given the circumstances. Malcolm had driven me home in his sensible Honda Accord, both of us maintaining the kind of determined silence that men adopt when they're about to do something that can't be undone. The house felt different when I walked through the front door, though I couldn't quite put my finger on why. Maybe it was knowing that this was potentially the last time I'd enter this space as a married man. Or maybe it was the strange absence of Claire's usual chaos. No purse dumped on the kitchen counter. No shoes kicked off randomly in the hallway. No half-empty coffee cups abandoned throughout the living room like archaeological evidence of her morning routine. She hadn't come home Thursday night. No surprise there. I'd gotten exactly one text message Friday evening while I was being discharged. Staying at my mother's tonight. We need to talk. No inquiry about my surgery, no concern about my recovery, no acknowledgement that she'd basically abandoned her husband during a medical emergency. Just another demand for my attention on her terms, as usual. Malcolm had stayed overnight in the guest room, and I'd heard him on the phone making arrangements with the efficiency of someone who'd clearly thought this through. My brother doesn't do anything halfway. When he decides to solve a problem, he attacks it with the methodical precision of an engineer designing a bridge. By morning, he had everything coordinated down to the minute. At exactly 8 a.m., a battered white van pulled into my driveway with Ortega Locksmith Services painted on the side in faded blue letters. Out stepped Mr. Ortega himself, a compact man in his 60s who moved with the confident economy of someone who'd been changing locks for longer than I'd been alive. He carried a toolbox that looked like it had survived multiple wars and probably contained every lock-related tool ever invented. "You're Marcus?" Mr. Ortega asked, extending a calloused hand that could probably crack walnuts. "Your brother called me. Said you need new locks installed quickly and quietly." "That's right," I said, shaking his hand and immediately feeling better about this whole plan. There's something reassuring about working with a professional who doesn't ask unnecessary questions or make judgmental comments about your life choices. Mr. Ortega looked like he'd seen every possible reason why someone might need their locks changed, and nothing surprised him anymore. "Front door, back door, garage?" he asked, already examining the existing hardware with the critical eye of an expert. "All of it," Malcolm answered before I could speak. "She doesn't get back in without permission." Mr. Ortega nodded like this was the most reasonable request in the world, which it probably was from his perspective. He started whistling something that sounded like old Mexican folk music while he unpacked his tools, the kind of cheerful working song that suggested he actually enjoyed his job. Must be nice, I thought, to have work that produces clear, measurable results. You change a lock, problem solved. No ambiguity, no emotional complications, no wondering if you're making the right decision. While Mr. Ortega worked his magic on the door hardware, another vehicle arrived. This one a much larger truck with reliable moving services emblazoned across its side in bold red letters. The driver was a woman who looked like she could bench press a refrigerator without breaking a sweat. She introduced herself as Eliza and immediately took charge of the situation with the kind of no-nonsense authority that made me understand why Malcolm had chosen this particular company. "We're doing a partial household move," Eliza explained, consulting a clipboard that probably contained more detailed logistics than the D-Day invasion. "Personal belongings of one individual, leaving all furniture and shared items. My crew knows what to look for." Her crew turned out to be 3 college-aged kids who moved through my house like a well-trained military unit. They had boxes, tape, markers, and bubble wrap, plus that supernatural ability that professional movers possess to estimate exactly how much space any given collection of stuff will require. Within minutes, they were systematically going through Claire's belongings with the methodical efficiency of people who'd done this exact job hundreds of times before. The process was both fascinating and deeply depressing to watch. 9 years of marriage reduced to 58 cardboard boxes, each one carefully labeled with its contents in Eliza's neat handwriting. Bedroom clothes, bathroom products, jewelry and accessories, kitchen items, personal. It was like watching an archaeological expedition in reverse, taking apart the layers of a shared life and separating them back into individual components. I found myself standing in the bedroom doorway, watching one of the college kids, a serious young man who looked like he was working his way through a philosophy degree, carefully wrapping Claire's collection of expensive perfume bottles. Each bottle probably cost more than this kid made in a week, but he handled them with the same professional care he'd shown to everything else. No judgment, no commentary, just doing the job he was paid to do. "You okay?" Malcolm asked, appearing beside me with 2 cups of coffee and the concerned expression he'd worn throughout this entire operation. "Yeah," I said, and was surprised to realize I meant it. "It's weird, but not as weird as I thought it would be." "That's because it's the right thing to do," Malcolm said. "You just never let yourself consider it before." He was probably right. For years, I'd been so focused on trying to make my marriage work that I'd never seriously considered what would happen if I stopped trying. The idea of Claire not living here, not filling the house with her particular brand of chaos, not being part of my daily routine, it should have felt devastating. Instead, it felt like finally exhaling after holding my breath for way too long. Mrs. Henderson from next door appeared at my front window, clearly curious about all the activity, but too polite to come over and ask directly. She'd been our neighbor for 7 years, had probably seen more of the ups and downs of our marriage than anyone except maybe Malcolm. I wondered what she thought about the moving truck, whether she was relieved or concerned or just grateful that the drama was finally reaching some kind of resolution. The jewelry box was the hardest part to watch them pack. Not because I'd given Claire most of the pieces, though I had, but because it represented all those occasions when I'd thought buying her something expensive would somehow fix whatever was wrong between us. Birthday earrings, anniversary necklaces, just because bracelets. Thousands of dollars worth of gilt purchases, all carefully wrapped and boxed up like evidence in a case about the failure of material solutions to emotional problems. By noon, it was done. 58 boxes stacked in the garage, each one tagged with a number and description. The locks had been changed, the keys tested, and Mr. Ortega had departed with a handshake and a business card, in case you need anything else. The moving crew had vanished as efficiently as they'd arrived, leaving behind only the bill and a house that felt simultaneously empty and somehow more spacious than it had in years. Now what? I asked Malcolm as we stood in the suddenly quiet living room. Now we wait, he said. And when she shows up, you hand her the new key and the garage door code, and you let her take her stuff and go. And if she wants to talk? Malcolm's smile was the same one he'd worn when we were kids, and he was about to deliver the punchline to an elaborate prank. Then you tell her you're too weak for conversation. By 3 o'clock Saturday afternoon, I was starting to think maybe Claire had decided to just disappear entirely, maybe run off to some tropical paradise with Leonard where they could live happily ever after without having to deal with inconvenient things like abandoned husbands or consequences for their actions. Part of me was almost hoping that's exactly what had happened, because the alternative, actually facing her after everything that had gone down, felt about as appealing as getting my appendix removed again without anesthesia. I was sitting in my workshop, not really working but just enjoying the familiar smells and sounds that had always been my refuge from the chaos of married life, when I heard car doors slamming in the driveway. Through the small window, I could see Vivian's sleek black Lexus parked behind Malcolm's Honda, and my stomach immediately started doing gymnastics that had nothing to do with recent surgery. Vivian Morrison, Claire's mother, and the human embodiment of everything wrong with modern society. She's one of those women who treats life like a competitive sport where the goal is to accumulate the most expensive stuff while looking down on everyone who can't afford to play at her level. 62 years old, perfectly preserved by a team of cosmetic professionals, and absolutely convinced that her daughter married beneath her station when she chose a furniture maker over the parade of lawyers and investment bankers. Vivian had been parading through Claire's life since college. Malcolm appeared in the workshop doorway, holding his phone and wearing the kind of grim expression that suggested he'd been monitoring the situation. "They're here," he said unnecessarily, since the sound of Vivian's voice berating someone, probably Claire, was already drifting through the closed windows. "You installed the video doorbell app on my phone, right?" I asked, feeling suddenly grateful for my brother's obsession with home security technology. "Already linked to your account," Malcolm confirmed. "You can see and hear everything from here without having to actually face the music until you're ready. God bless technology and overprotective older brothers." I opened the app on my phone and immediately had a front row seat to what was shaping up to be the most awkward doorstep confrontation in the history of suburban Chicago. The new video doorbell had a surprisingly clear picture, good enough that I could see every detail of Claire's face as she stood on what used to be our front porch, looking like she'd aged about 5 years in the past 2 days. She looked exhausted, which was satisfying in a petty way that probably made me a terrible person. Her usually perfect hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail. She wasn't wearing makeup, something that hadn't happened since our honeymoon, and her clothes looked like she'd slept in them, which she probably had. This was not the polished, put-together Claire who'd been too busy for her husband's medical emergency. This was someone who was finally starting to understand that actions have consequences. Vivian, on the other hand, looked exactly like she always did, perfectly coiffed, expensively dressed, and radiating the kind of entitled indignation that comes from a lifetime of believing the world owes you special treatment. She was gesturing dramatically at the front door while delivering what appeared to be a lecture about proper behavior and social expectations. "Told you this would happen," Vivian was saying, her voice carrying clearly through the doorbell's microphone. I warned you that Marcus would eventually show his true colors. Men like him always do when they don't get their way. Men like him. As if being a working-class craftsman automatically made me some kind of vindictive sociopath instead of just a guy who'd finally gotten tired of being treated like garbage by his own wife. But that was Vivian for you. Everything was always about class and status and keeping up appearances, never about actual human decency or treating people with respect. Claire was fumbling with her keys, apparently having forgotten that they wouldn't work anymore. She tried the front door handle twice before the reality of the situation started to sink in. I watched her face go through several interesting expressions: confusion, then understanding, then something that might have been panic. "The locks," she said quietly, more to herself than to her mother. "He changed the locks." "Of course he changed the locks," Vivian snapped. It's exactly the kind of petty, vindictive behavior I'd expect from someone of his background. No class, no dignity, no understanding of how civilized people handle marital difficulties. That's when I decided to unlock the door remotely, partly because I wanted to get this confrontation over with, and partly because I was curious to see Claire's reaction to the current state of our front hallway. The electronic lock clicked open with a soft beep, and Claire pushed the door open cautiously, like she was entering a stranger's house instead of the place she'd lived for 9 years. The look on her face when she saw the wall of labeled boxes was everything I'd hoped for and more. 58 cardboard boxes stacked neatly in the entryway, each one tagged with its contents in Eliza's professional handwriting. Her entire life with me, reduced to a logistics problem and solved with typical moving company efficiency. Claire stood frozen in the doorway, staring at the boxes like she was trying to process what she was seeing. For the first time since I'd known her, she looked genuinely shocked, like she'd finally encountered a situation that her usual combination of manipulation and entitlement couldn't immediately fix. She reached out and touched one of the boxes, the one labeled wedding photos, with the kind of tentative gesture you'd use to pet a dangerous animal. "Marcus," she called out, her voice smaller than I'd heard it in years. "Marcus, are you here? We need to talk." Vivian pushed past her daughter and into the house, surveying the boxes with the kind of cold assessment she usually reserved for servants who disappointed her. "Well," she said, "at least he was efficient about it. Though I suppose that's what happens when you hire professionals instead of trying to handle things yourself." "He can't just," Claire started to say, but Vivian cut her off with a sharp gesture. "Of course he can. It's his house, isn't it? You never insisted on putting your name on the deed, despite my advice. Another one of your romantic mistakes coming back to haunt you." Claire's face crumpled slightly at that reminder of her financial vulnerability, and for a moment I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. Then I remembered her text messages, her refusal to answer my calls during my medical emergency, her years of treating me like an inconvenience in my own life. "Marcus," Claire called again, louder this time, with a note of desperation creeping into her voice. "Please, I know you're here. I can explain everything. About Leonard, about Thursday, about all of it. I was scared, and I made mistakes, but we can fix this." Scared. That was a new one. Scared of what exactly? Scared of having to actually act like a wife when her husband needed her? Scared of choosing her marriage over her affair? Scared of facing the consequences of her choices? "Stop wasting time," Vivian commanded, already examining the boxes to see which ones she'd need help carrying. "Leonard is waiting in the car, and I have a dinner engagement at 6. We don't have all day for this melodrama." And there it was. Even now, even in this moment when her marriage was literally being dismantled around her, Leonard was still the priority, still waiting for her, still more important than dealing with the aftermath of her choices. Some people never learn. Claire looked back toward the kitchen, toward the workshop, toward anywhere I might be hiding, and for just a moment her carefully constructed facade cracked completely. I saw fear there, real fear, maybe for the first time understanding that some mistakes can't be undone with apologies and explanations. But it was too late for fear. About 9 years too late. Through the doorbell camera, I watched my wife of 9 years begin the process of carrying her life out of our house, one box at a time. 3 weeks. That's how long it took for my entire world to flip itself inside out and somehow end up making more sense than it had in years. 3 weeks since Claire had loaded her 58 boxes into Vivian's Lexus and Leonard's white Tesla. 3 weeks since I'd watched through my phone screen as my marriage got reduced to a logistical problem and solved with professional efficiency. You'd think 3 weeks wouldn't be enough time to process the end of a 9-year relationship, but apparently when that relationship has been slowly dying for years, the actual death comes as more of a relief than a tragedy. The physical recovery from surgery had been easier than expected. Turns out when you're not constantly stressed about your wife's mysterious lunch dates and emotional manipulation, your body heals a lot faster. The scar on my abdomen was already fading from angry red to pale pink, and Dr. Martinez had cleared me to return to light work in the shop. "Just don't lift anything heavier than 20 pounds for another week," she'd said during my follow-up appointment, "and try to avoid any more life-altering drama until you're fully healed." If only it were that simple to avoid drama when you're married to Claire Morrison Ellison. Or rather, when you were married to her, past tense, because the divorce papers had been filed faster than I would have thought possible. Turns out when one spouse abandons the other during a medical emergency, and there are text messages to prove it, divorce attorneys get very excited about their chances of success. Claire had tried calling 17 times in the first week. 17. I know because Malcolm had helped me set up a call blocking app that kept a detailed log of every attempt at contact. The calls had started desperate and gradually evolved into angry, then back to desperate, then to threatening, and finally to pathetic. I'd listened to exactly one voicemail, the first one, where she'd cried and apologized and explained how Leonard had been pressuring her, and she'd been confused and scared and never meant for things to go so far. The thing about apologies is that they only work when the person offering them understands what they're actually apologizing for. Claire seemed to think she was sorry for getting caught, for the public embarrassment at the Sterling room, for the inconvenient timing of my medical emergency. She didn't seem to grasp that she was apologizing for choosing another man over her husband's life, for years of treating our marriage like an inconvenience, for turning into someone I didn't recognize and probably never really knew in the first place. By the second week, the desperate phone calls had been replaced by long, rambling emails that read like term papers on why I should forgive her and take her back. She'd apparently been seeing a therapist, probably at Vivian's insistence, and had learned a lot of fancy psychological terms to explain her behavior. Emotional avoidance, fear of vulnerability, compartmentalization as a defense mechanism. It was like reading a self-help book written by someone who'd completely missed the point of every chapter. I'd set up a filter that sent all her emails directly to a folder I never opened. Malcolm had suggested I save them for the divorce proceedings, but honestly, I didn't need more evidence of what she'd become. The text messages from that Thursday afternoon were plenty. The most interesting development had come from Mrs. Henderson, my 70-year-old neighbor who apparently had a much better understanding of what had been going on in my marriage than I did. She'd stopped by the previous Tuesday afternoon with a casserole and some information that explained a lot about Claire's mysterious schedule. "I didn't want to say anything while you two were together, Mrs. Henderson had said, settling into my kitchen chair with the satisfied expression of someone about to deliver some premium gossip. "But I've been seeing that white Tesla in your driveway every Tuesday afternoon for months. Usually around 1 o'clock, gone by 4. I figured you knew about it, but then after what happened with your surgery." Tuesday afternoons. While I was at the shop, working late to finish custom orders and build the business that paid for Claire's lifestyle, she'd been entertaining Leonard in our house, in our bed, probably laughing about what a clueless husband she'd married. The audacity was almost impressive in its completeness. "How long?" I'd asked Mrs. Henderson, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. "Since last spring, at least. Maybe longer. I only started noticing because he always parked in the same spot, right where it blocked my view of the street when I was trying to back out of my driveway. Since last spring." So while I'd been planning our anniversary dinner, Claire had already been planning her exit strategy. While I'd been working extra hours to surprise her with a weekend getaway to Door County, she'd been working extra hours to betray everything we'd built together. The timeline was almost funny in its cruelty. But here's the weird thing. Learning about the Tuesday afternoon visits didn't make me angry. It should have, probably. Finding out your wife has been bringing her lover into your home while you're working to support her should trigger some kind of primal rage response. Instead, it just made everything make sense for the first time in months. All those Tuesday evenings when Claire had been unusually cheerful, all those Wednesday mornings when she'd seemed satisfied in a way that had nothing to do with me, all those times I'd wondered if I was imagining the distance between us. I wasn't imagining anything. I was just married to someone who'd checked out of our relationship so completely that she'd started living a double life in our own house. The workshop had become my sanctuary again, the way it used to be before I'd started letting Claire's chaos bleed into every aspect of my existence. I'd finished the Hendersons' dining chairs. They looked beautiful, if I do say so myself, and had started working on a custom bookshelf for a client in Lincoln Park. There's something deeply satisfying about working with wood, about taking raw materials and turning them into something functional and beautiful. Unlike marriages, furniture doesn't lie to you or cheat on you or abandon you when you need it most. Diego had been stopping by every few days, officially to help with projects, but really to make sure I was handling everything okay. The kid was worried about me, which was sweet in a way that reminded me there were still people in the world who gave a damn about each other's well-being without expecting anything in return. "You seem different, Mr. E," Diego had said the previous Thursday, looking up from the chair leg he was sanding. "Lighter somehow. Like you can breathe better." He was right. I could breathe better. For the first time in years, I wasn't walking on eggshells in my own house, wasn't constantly trying to anticipate Claire's moods or avoid triggering one of her dramatic episodes. I wasn't checking my phone every 5 minutes to see if she'd texted about being late for dinner or needing space, or whatever new crisis required my immediate attention and endless patience. Raymond had been coming by regularly too, usually bearing beer and the kind of blunt commentary that only your oldest friend can get away with delivering. "You know what the best part of this whole situation is?" He'd said the previous Saturday, settling into the lawn chair I'd dragged out to the workshop. "You're finally acting like yourself again instead of some beaten-down version of Marcus that Claire created." That hit closer to home than I cared to admit. When had I stopped being myself and started being the person Claire needed me to be to make her happy? When had I started measuring my worth by her approval instead of my own accomplishments? When had I become so focused on saving our marriage that I'd forgotten to ask whether it was worth saving? Tonight, sitting alone in my workshop with a cup of coffee and the satisfaction of a day's honest work, I found myself thinking about the future for the first time in years. Not our future, not the compromises and negotiations and careful emotional choreography that had defined my marriage, but my future. What I wanted to do, where I wanted to go, how I wanted to spend the rest of my life. The house was quiet in a way it hadn't been since Claire moved out. Not the tense, walking on eggshells quiet of a marriage falling apart, but the peaceful quiet of a man who'd finally stopped fighting a war he was never going to win. My phone sat silent on the workbench. No texts about lunch plans or mood swings or demands for attention. Just silence. And for the first time in my adult life, silence felt like freedom. I picked up a piece of oak I'd been working on, running my fingers along the smooth grain and feeling the potential hidden in the wood. Tomorrow I'd shape it into something beautiful and functional, something that would last for generations if it was cared for properly. Unlike marriages built on lies and convenience, good craftsmanship endures. Outside, Mrs. Henderson's porch light came on, and I could see her settling in with a book and a cup of tea. Normal people living normal lives, not constantly managing crises or making excuses for people who didn't deserve them. That's what I wanted, normal, peaceful, real. I wasn't weak. I'd never been weak. I'd just been married to someone who needed me to believe I was weak so she could feel strong. But that chapter of my life was over now, filed away with all the other mistakes you make when you're young and stupid enough to think love conquers everything. Claire had been right about one thing, though. I was too weak for her. Too weak to lie, too weak to cheat, too weak to abandon someone I'd promised to love in sickness and in health. Thank God for that weakness. It had saved my life.